Hey guys, welcome back to our April 14th video lecture. Today we're going to be talking about D-Day, the liberation of several different death camps, and the eventual surrender of Nazi Germany. So let's go ahead and get right to it. Bombs dropped near Auschwitz. In August of 1944, American planes had dropped thousands of bombs near an oil production factory just 5 miles away from Auschwitz. Now, Auschwitz, as we talked about last week, was the largest of all Nazi death camps. Jewish organizations around the world, the War Refugee Board, and others urged the U.S. government to drop bombs on Auschwitz itself. Now, this was not a suggestion that was taken lightly. If you were to drop bombs on Auschwitz, you would inevitably kill many prisoners of war. That was going to happen. But people felt that by bombing Auschwitz, you would actually save more lives in the long run. If you were to just let them stay there, the Nazis may kill even more than bombing would. Moving on to the next slide. A dream of freedom. The individual that you see pictured there is a man named Elie Wiesel. Elie Wiesel was a prisoner at Auschwitz and wrote a book titled Night. If you've never read it, I highly suggest it. It's fantastic. American military officials opposed the bombing of Auschwitz, claiming they could not afford to divert resources from military targets. They also argued that such bombing could kill many prisoners. And we just talked about that. Elie Wiesel, a prisoner at the Auschwitz death camp, later said he would have welcomed the bombs anyway. This is what he said. "We were no longer afraid of death. Every bomb filled us with joy and gave us new confidence in life." Think about how dire your situation has to be to hope for bombs to drop where you are at, right? Because again, if you're in that situation, you feel like you at least have a chance to live. If left to the Nazis, they felt like they had no chance of survival. Okay, moving on to the next slide. Operation Overlord. The Allies eventually chose not to bomb Auschwitz, claiming that doing so would delay the end of the war. To meet their objective, the Allied military instead focused most of its efforts in 1944 on the invasion of France, codenamed Operation Overlord. Okay, moving on to the next slide. D-Day. General Eisenhower directed the French invasion, commanding about 1,200 warships, 800 transport ships, 4,000 landing craft, 10,000 airplanes, and hundreds of tanks. In other words, this would be the largest single amphibious invasion in the history of the world. Allied troops would cross the English Channel by ship and land on the beaches of Normandy in northern France. D-Day, which is what this day is known as, would take place on June 6th, 1944, the Day of Days. Okay, next slide. Making safe the world. Eisenhower sent the first wave of 156,000 troops with a message of hope. And this is what he said. "You will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world." Imagine Eisenhower's position. Imagine anyone's position at this time. You know, so many of these men that you're speaking to are not going to live through the engagement. It had to be an extremely difficult time for everyone involved. All right, next slide. Hell on Earth. The landing craft unloaded Allied troops on Normandy's 5 beaches, while warships provided cover and gunfire from offshore. German gun batteries aimed at the mass of invading soldiers who were wading ashore, crawling along the sand and climbing the dunes and cliffs. One soldier later described his arrival on Omaha Beach like this. "It seemed like the whole world had exploded. There was gunfire from battleships, destroyers, cruisers. The bombers were still hitting the beaches. As we went in, we could see small craft from the 116th Infantry that had gone in ahead sunk. There were bodies bobbing in the water, even out 3 or 4 miles. Just an unbelievable situation. Right, on the next slide, you can see the different beachheads that were established during Operation Overlord. You have Omaha Beach, you have Utah Beach, That's where the Americans were focused at. And then you have the other beach fronts all across and by the British and the Canadian forces as well. Okay, moving on to the next slide. Fortress Europa is breached. Paris is liberated. The great thing about liberating Paris and France as a whole is that you've got an ally back in the war, right? It's similar to when Italy fell and Italy came in on the side of the Allies. France is going to be the same way. After the soldiers regrouped from the chaotic landing, they would eventually secure the 59-mile section of the Normandy beachhead. In July, General Bradley and General Bernard Montgomery, respectively, led the American and British armies on a rapid sweep through France. The Allies liberated Paris that August, and in September, were already moving into Germany. So once the Allies established a beachhead, they were able to move through Europe. So now you have the Soviets pushing from the east, you have the Americans and the Brits pushing from the west, and you also have Americans and Brits pushing up from the south through Italy, right? Slowly but surely, it's starting to collapse on Nazi Germany. The Red Wave, next slide. While the Americans conducted the invasion of France, the Red Army chased a retreating German force out of the Soviet Union and into Poland. SS officials in Poland frantically attempted to hide concentration camp evidence from the approaching Red Army. They emptied many of the forced labor camps, marching prisoners westward and shooting those who fell behind. Hiding the truth. Next slide. They also tried to dismantle some of the death camps. In fact, with the Red Army closing in on Auschwitz, the Nazis crowded about 60,000 Jews and others onto freight trains and shipped them west into Germany. The survivors were sent to camps like Buchenwald and Dachau. Moving on to the next slide. Allied soldiers fighting their way through Germany stumbled upon concentration camps. Even though these camps were not as grim as the death camps in Poland, the reality was still extraordinarily shocking. The people who were found would be described as living skeletons, too sick to eat, and died in the weeks following their liberations. Perhaps one of the saddest realities was because these people were so emaciated, when Allies liberated them, they found that some of these individuals would eat so much food or drink so much to try and replenish themselves that they would actually end up killing themselves. It's just an unbelievably sad situation. The picture that we see on this slide, you can't help but just be destroyed by what these men in this image must have endured, what they must have seen, what they certainly lived through. It's just beyond words. Next slide. Genocide. At Dachau, the smell of the dead what was overwhelming. Our GIs described it at great length. They also uncovered evidence of medical research. SS camp doctors had carried out inhumane experiments on more than 3,500 prisoners. The Nazis had committed crimes so reprehensible that our language, the English language, had no word for it. In 1944, a Polish Jew coined the term genocide, right, to refer to the systematic killing of a racial, political, or cultural group. Certainly described what took place. Now, when we talk about what happened to the Jews and other minority groups during this time period, it's oftentimes not referred to as a genocide. It's referred to as the Holocaust. Well, the Nazis had killed some 6 million Jews. That was at that time about 40% of the Jewish population in the world. An existing word meaning sacrifice by fire or Holocaust was then capitalized and used to refer to the mass slaughter. The Holocaust was the Nazi systematic state-sponsored persecution and murder of Jews and other minority groups. It's the darkest hour of human history, without a doubt. All right, moving on to the next slide. The Battle of the Bulge. Even though it is becoming more apparent that Nazi Germany will be defeated, that doesn't mean that Hitler will not risk more men and material to try and hold off the Allies. Well, when the Allies crossed into Germany from France, they met fierce resistance, not surprisingly. And by December of 1944, their offensive had stalled. Hitler strategized to push through the Allied lines and hope to break the lines and be able to sweep around behind them. Hitler launched his counteroffensive on December 16th, when 8 German armored divisions smashed into the surprised Americans, creating a bulge in the line. Fortunately, the line would not break. Okay, next slide. The death of Hitler. Allied air support and fast action from Patton's Third Army forced the Germans' withdrawal by mid-January. The Battle of the Bulge was the last German offensive on the Western Front. From this point forward, Germany is being pushed back step by step to Berlin. By April 1945, the Red Army had fought its way through Poland into Germany and was on the outskirts of its capital city, Berlin. On April 30th, with advancing Soviet soldiers half a mile from the bunker, from Hitler's Berlin bunker, Hitler would commit suicide. Okay. And last slide for the day, VE Day. German forces quickly began to surrender, and at midnight on May 8th, the war in Europe officially came to an end. President Roosevelt unfortunately would not live to celebrate Victory in Europe Day, or VE Day as it's known, since he had died on April 12th in Warm Springs, Georgia. The new president, Harry S. Truman, would dedicate the victory to Franklin Roosevelt. Now, keep in mind, with a different president now, there's going to be some major decisions that Harry Truman is going to make, and we're going to talk about those decisions in the coming days. All right, I hope you're well. I miss you all very much. Stay safe, and I hope to see you soon. Bye.